Welcome to Western Region Pastoral Institute. Today's lecture is lecture number 2, and the topic is geography, the geography of the New Testament. So I'm going to get right into it. We're going to do a screen share video. So mostly what you'll see are these great maps that I've discovered. I put a link up on the Google Plus page for you, so that you can see these maps. Let's see if I can get the original site. That's not it. Here it is. Searchingthescriptures.net. Interestingly enough, when I just typed that in, it took me to a different site. So follow the link that's on the Google Plus page. As you can see, these maps go all the way back to the ancient Near East. So these would cover pre-biblical and Hebrew Bible period, Egyptian, the Exodus, conquest. So these are all the Old Testament ones. But I love this site because the maps are quite nice. And so we'll just kind of start with the Hellenistic period, where we left off with the Old Testament. But what we'll do is we'll look at this map first, this map of the division of the Greek Empire after Alexander the Great. And if you remember from our reading, there's two groups of people that are significant for biblical studies in the intertestamental period, that is the period between the Old and the New Testaments. They would be the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and hopefully you can see my cursor. But the Ptolemies, basically the division of the Greek Empire after Alexander the Great's death, was divided amongst 4 of his generals. And I won't go into too much detail because it's just too much information for our purposes. But nonetheless, what you need to know is that 2 of these generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus, basically had these regions that they ruled over. So the green area is the Seleucid Empire, and there's some variation on the pronunciation. Some people say Seleucid, as I do. Some people say Seleucid. Anyway, that's the green part of this map, and the Ptolemies would be this orange part of the map. And basically, there were these two kingdoms fought over Palestine. They fought over this area. As we talked about in the Old Testament geography section, the area here that is occupied by Israel, this area of Palestine, is a very important land mass area in terms of kingdoms. The reason being that in this period of time, sea travel was very primitive. It was not the main means of transporting goods, services, travel, or even military. So if you were going to have a kingdom that spanned the world, as every early kingdom tried to do, they were totally into Pinky and the Brain back then. They wanted to conquer the world. And that would include Egypt and the southern region here and over into here. So you see how this was a very important piece of property, because all of this from here all the way up through here and around here is all desert. This area, the Syro-Arabian desert, is very difficult to travel on foot over. So typically travel went this way, not direct. It wouldn't go from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea across this. They would actually travel all the way around, typically following the river, which would make a lot of sense. And so this would be the area of travel. So that's why this area is really worthwhile. It was a very precious piece of property. And so there were lots of battles that raged here so that you could control this narrow passage between Egypt and the north. And so, as you remember from our reading, the Seleucids had the early reign over Palestine, and the Ptolemies had the later reign. And that's what leads up to the Maccabean revolt and all of those things. So just kind of a division of the empire of the Greek Empire of Alexander. And I think you'll notice these maps are great. I love these maps. They're nice, they're colorful, they're clear, they're clean. So that's a great map. So let's move on from there to, let's see, what would be good? Well, we'll just kind of check it out. Here's a map of Palestine with Maccabees. That's not very helpful for us. You can look at that later and read it if you like, but we'll just kind of leave that. All right, so that's kind of this era. As we move into the New Testament focus on maps, we move away from tribal divisions into more just territories. And these territories are now beginning to be determined by these different occupations. First by the Greeks. Hellenistic would be a reference to Greek empires, and then by the Romans. So if we come down here, Augustus took power, Caesar Augustus, in about 163. And so as the Roman Empire began to spread, they began to take over, well, a lot of this region that was previously governed by the Greeks. And so now the area that we're concerned with, the New Testament area, the nation of Israel, is ruled by Romans. This is important for later, this twofold reign of Greeks and Romans. What I want you to see as we walk through this study on geography is that these two kingdoms, these two empires, provide two very important things that grease the skids for the spread of the gospel. The Greek Empire gives the language of the region. Greek became what's known as the lingua franca. And so there was a common language that was spoken. Commerce and otherwise throughout the region, people were typically conversant in Greek. Hence, the New Testament is written in Greek so that the world can read the gospel. The second thing is what the Romans provide is called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Being a stable empire, there was ease of travel for Paul, the apostles, as they spread the gospel. And so those two things, in terms of empires, really helped. The third thing that helped to spread the gospel and cause it to be a worldwide phenomenon is the exile, or what's known as the diaspora. And we'll see a map of that as well. So when we get to that period of time, or that map, I'll show you how the nation had been spread throughout the known world. So those three significant events, the Greek lingua franca, the Roman peace, or the Pax Romana, and the Jewish diaspora, all three of those events serve to really facilitate the spread of the gospel. And so here, this map of the Roman Empire is typical of where the gospel initially spread in those early years. And typically this would have been what was known as the entire world, or the inhabited world. And so when you read the New Testament and it speaks about the world, you probably shouldn't think about the globe. You probably shouldn't think about what a modern would think about in terms of the term world. Their perspective about the world is the colored area of what you're looking at right here. a little bit more of a spread, because in this area over here, they would have certainly considered that to be part of the inhabited or known world. But essentially, they would have been thinking about the area of the occupation of the Roman Empire. And so it's kind of good to see this map here. Later on, the Roman rule would extend, but nonetheless, that would be what we would understand as the Roman Empire. In the world of Jesus, this is probably a good map to show. We have the division of Herod's kingdom. The Romans allowed Israel to be quasi-self-ruled. Herod was an Edomite. Edom would have been from this area here, and he is a foreign ruler essentially, and yet he's seen as at least closer to the Jews than not. So here you have some of these names that you'll probably be familiar with, because the kingdom, this area was divided, and it was divided amongst Herod's sons in this region. All right, let's see which is the next map that I want to show you. Let's go to one of these maps. There's another map that I'd like to show you that has, this is, mostly just kind of a map with some major roads, the different regions and territories. Again, the regions of the different Herods, Herod Antipas and Philip, and these different guys. So here you have the territory of Philip. Let's just kind of say that here's a city that is very important in the Bible, Caesarea Philippi. And Caesarea Philippi is named after Philip. And here is Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is a significant geographical feature that you should be aware of in Israel and for Old and New Testament purposes. It's here at Caesarea Philippi that Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And he gets Peter's response, "You are the Christ." And that's significant. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So here's Galilee, the region where Jesus lived early. Here's Nazareth. The name Sepphoris is becoming a much more talked about city. Apparently, this was a major city in the area. Nazareth was not as big a city, and the work that Jesus probably did, he probably did as the misnomer is carpenter, but as a literally construction worker. He probably worked with stone. Much of that may have been in Sepphoris. Here's Capernaum. This part of the world is known as the Decapolis, and it's primarily a Gentile region. So when Jesus comes over here, this is probably here in Gergesa, where he, in Mark chapter 5, casts out the legion of demons from the man who couldn't be chained. Here you have Jerusalem and Judean Valley. Here's Jericho, the Jordan River where Jesus was baptized. Let's see if this one does. No, that's not the one I was looking for. What I'm looking for is a map that gives us more of the contours of the region. I thought, let's see if this is the one. Well, let's talk about this one. This kind of gives you the traveling of Jesus back and forth. Now, it's interesting. Sometimes he traveled directly through Samaria. Samaria sat between Judea and Galilee. And Samaria, if you remember, is the place where Jews who were assimilated into Assyrian culture and intermarried with Syrians this is where they lived. This would be the bulk or the center of the northern kingdom of the Old Testament, 722, when Assyria conquered this section. They intermarried, and the Samaritans were what were considered by the Jews to be half-breeds. So just so you know, typically Jews wouldn't travel this way up and down. They would generally travel down into the Jordan River basin and avoid Samaria and travel along the river up and down. So when Jesus decides to go through, he's deciding to do that purposefully. And so that's an important kind of geographical feature to be aware of. Now, I was looking for the topographical map to talk about Mount Hermon and the Rift Valley and the Dead Sea. Let's see. If I can't remember where that one was, we'll go to the back to this one. All right, we'll go back to that one, and I'll just have you use your imagination. So as you remember, up in this region is Caesarea Philippi. It's north of the northernmost edge of this particular map. It is the highest region in the area. Mount Hermon, I think, is a 9,700 foot peak. And so you have the heights up here. It's the highest point. And in this area, this Jordan River Valley is also known as the Rift Valley. And the Rift Valley is the lowest place on Earth. So it is a almost 1,300 feet below sea level, this Jordan Rift Valley. So it is known as one of the lowest places on Earth. And it's interesting to think about Jesus's ministry. He probably starts his ministry down here in the Jordan River, somewhere outside of Jericho. This is most likely where John was baptizing. People from Jerusalem were coming to John, and there was a route, this particular route here, that went down to Jericho. It would be the same route where the story of the Good Samaritan takes place. But Jesus probably starts his ministry down here, the baptism of John, at the lowest place on earth. So he starts at the lowest place on earth. His ministry goes between Jerusalem and Galilee. And then he travels north to Caesarea Philippi, where you have the testimony of Peter. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And once that happens, they begin his descent again into Jerusalem to be crucified. And he most likely again traveled through the lowest place on earth. So there's some symbolism that is there in the travels of Christ. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 8 says, therefore, it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives and gave gifts to men. Now, this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? And so this descent of Christ is an interesting idea to talk about. First of all, from the big picture, descending from heaven, coming to earth, taking on flesh, being involved in ministry, and then even during the course of his ministry geographically, taking his ministry to the heights of Mount Hermon, then descending to the lowest point on earth and submitting himself to be killed. It's a fascinating idea to talk about and to think about. So sometimes this geography helps us to kind of understand or even picture some movements of Christ, even some larger movements of Christ as he goes back and forth in his ministry. This map here is a good one to show the Pentecost and the Jewish diaspora. So if you look at this map here, it says cities with Jewish population. So you'll see all these cities here are cities where there were known Jewish populations. And as you can see, these cities are spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond the Roman Empire into the old Babylonian, Persian, Greek Empire. Here's another map where you see this spread in really the crucible or the birthplace of Christianity, which is Turkey. Now, my encouragement to you is that sometime in your life you make a trip to Israel. It's a great trip. I've never been to Turkey, and before I die, I'd love to go there and visit some of these great cities where Christianity was born. But as you notice, there is a reason for that the diaspora occurred long term, because then all the apostles would have places where they would find affinity with Jewish people, and they could begin the spread of the gospel there. In fact, we see that's the pattern. When Paul goes to these towns, he finds a synagogue, and he finds a Jewish community, and he begins his preaching of the gospel with Jews in these key cities. Also, when you read Acts chapter 2, you'll find these different place names as people from these places come to Jerusalem. They're typically Jews who made pilgrimage to Jerusalem for certain holidays, Passover being one of them. And so many Jews who traveled to Jerusalem for Passover and were there during the time of Jesus' death were still there at the time of Pentecost. And so, again, the providence of God bringing people back, hearing the gospel, many people came to be saved, and they then traveled back to their towns laden with the knowledge of the gospel. So it's a fascinating feature of Old Testament geography. The other part of geography that you want to be familiar with are the journeys of Paul. And so here is your typical map of the first journey of Paul. One thing you want to know is that in the book of Acts, there's two Antiochs. There's Antioch in Syria, and there's Pisidian Antioch here. And those are both place names in the New Testament. Syrian Antioch was really Paul's home church launch pad for his missionary journeys. The church in Antioch is the church that sends Paul out. So basically he travels by boat to the island of Cyprus. He travels by boat to Turkey and then makes a little tour through here and then travels back by boat to Antioch. And so you have this first missionary journey of Paul occurring in Acts 13:4 to 14:28. This region up here is known as Asia Minor. When you read the introduction to First Peter, you will see a lot of these place names mentioned. So First Peter 1:1 says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen. So here is that region that Peter is writing to, this area here. So that's, again, this is modern day Turkey, and back then was known as Asia Minor. Here's the region of Galatia, where Paul wrote the letters to the Galatians. We will get to the cities of the book of Revelation, but here's Colossae, that's the city of Colossians. Here's Ephesus, Ephesians. Smyrna is one of the 7 cities. We'll talk about Patmos in a while. All right, so that's the first missionary journey. Second missionary journey is here. So if we start out again from Antioch, He's traveling by land this time, and you can see some of the geographical features that force his movement. There are obviously mountains here, and this is a pass. So he comes to here, where he has the vision of the man of Macedonia saying, come on over here. And so again, the gospel begins to spread further out into the world. And then there is a circle back to Jerusalem and then back home to Antioch. And so this missionary journey would be from Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 18:32. Again, great maps. Nice, colorful, clear maps. Here's Corinth, Athens, Thessalonica. Here's Philippi, so Philippians, Thessalonians, Corinthians. You've got all these books. These are the places. Here's the Bereans. They don't have a book, but they're well known for being faithful to test everything that Paul taught. And so that's a great city to be aware of as well. And now we go to the third missionary journey. Same sort of thing. We're going to start here in Antioch and travel again. This time he doesn't go north. He cuts across and heads to Ephesus, and then heads north across the way, visiting the same cities, going back, kind of following this pattern, and then heading back to Jerusalem, where he then is imprisoned and makes his final journey to Rome. So his arrest and his imprisonment, here's the final journey to Rome. This one takes him via sea. This is where he has a shipwreck, and he ends up in Rome as he appeals to Nero. And that brings the book of Acts to a close. Here's the churches in Revelation. So these churches were on a circuit, so to speak. So there was, if you go in this circle, these are the seven churches: Laodicea, Philadelphia, Sardis, Thyatira, Pergamum, Smyrna, and Ephesus. Ephesus is really where John had his headquarters. And here is the island Patmos where John writes Revelation. Again, this is the west coast of Turkey, and this would be Greece over here. All right. Finally, I want to show you this map, Christian expansion in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This would be, again, one of the maps that shows the extent of the Christian faith as it spreads throughout the world. Now, interestingly enough, Paul is interested in preaching the gospel to the ends of the earth. So the reason for that is found in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, where in the Sermon on the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Paul took this on as his mantle, as his purpose. And so in the book of Romans, he references this desire to fulfill the words of Jesus. So Romans 10:18, he says, "But I say, surely they have never heard, have they? Indeed they have. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." At the end of this chapter or book in chapter 15, he talks about his desire to go to Spain. And so he's pushing to go to Spain because, as far as he's concerned, Spain is the end of the world. And so, therefore, when I have finished this and I put my seal on this fruit of theirs, I will go on by way of you to Spain. He writes that to the Romans in Romans chapter 15, verse 28. And then in Colossians, there's some interesting verses. In Colossians 1:6, He says, they've heard in the word of truth the gospel which has come to you, just as in all the world, also it is constantly bearing fruit and increasing, even as it has been doing in you since the day you heard of it and understood the grace of God in truth. And then down to verse 23, if indeed you continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. What's interesting, in the book of Colossians, he seems to declare that this event has already occurred, that the gospel has spread throughout the world, and in a very real sense, it had begun that process. And so we see this occupation here of Christianity throughout the second and third centuries as part of that initial prophetic fulfillment. All right. Hopefully these maps will be helpful for you. It's a great source, and that'll do it for lecture number 2.